Before we start today's episode, please be advised that this episode includes discussions of sensitive topics such as suicide and the loss of children. Listener discretion is advised. She gave birth to a monster that would haunt the world's imagination forever. She dared to explore the boundaries between life and death, science and hubris. She wrote a tale of creation and consequence, of loneliness and the desire for acceptance. Her work was revolutionary, misunderstood, and born from the darkest storms of the mind and soul. Yet Mary Shelley's name would become synonymous with the birth of modern Gothic and science fiction. But behind the legend was a life of tragedy and resilience. Loss, scandal, exile, and the weight of grief shadowed her every step. A woman ahead of her time, brilliant, defiant, and often overshadowed by the towering men around her. She wrestled with love and loss, creativity and despair, while forging a legacy that still captivates today. This is the Author Files. I'm Kane, and this is the extraordinary, turbulent, and fiercely creative life of Mary Shelley. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Author Files. In today's episode, we're going to be diving into the extraordinary life of Mary Shelley, the woman behind one of the most iconic novels ever written, Frankenstein. But Mary's story is so much more than just a famous book. It's a tale of loss, love, rebellion, and resilience, set against the backdrop of a turbulent time in history. Born into a world of intellectual giants and radical ideas, Mary's life was marked by tragedy from the very start. Yet she rose above it all to become a literary pioneer who challenged society's expectations and redefined what it meant to be a woman, a writer, and a creator. In this episode, we'll explore the remarkable journey that took Mary from the shadow of her mother's early death, through passionate and complicated relationships, devastating grief, and relentless battles for recognition, right up to her lasting legacy that still captivates readers and thinkers today. So buckle up for a story that's as gripping and dramatic as any novel, filled with genius, heartbreak, and the kind of courage that continues to inspire. This is the life of Mary Shelley. Let's begin. Mary Shelley was actually born Mary Wollstone Godwin in Somerstown, London, in 1797. And honestly, her parentage alone already makes her fascinating. She was the second child of the feminist philosopher, educator, and writer Mary Wollstonecraft, and the first child of the philosopher, novelist, and journalist William Godwin. But tragically, Wollstone died of puerperal fever just days after Mary was born, so Godwin was left to raise baby Mary alongside her older half-sister Fanny Imlay, who was Wollstonecraft's child from her relationship with the American speculator Gilbert Imlay. About a year after Wollstone's death, Godwin published Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1798. He intended it as a sincere and loving tribute to his late wife, but it absolutely scandalized people at the time. The book openly discussed Wollstonecraft's affairs and the fact that she had an illegitimate child, which by late 18th century standards was shocking. What's really important, though, is that Mary herself read these memoirs, along with her mother's books growing up. She was actively encouraged to cherish her mother's memory and legacy, which feels incredibly significant when you think about the kind of writer Mary would later become. Mary's earliest childhood memories actually seems to have been a happy one. We know this from letters written by Louisa Jones, William Godwin's housekeeper and nurse at the time. But Godwin was often deeply in debt, and he came to believe he couldn't raise the children alone, so he began looking for a second wife. In December 1801, he married Mary Jane Clairmont, a well-educated woman who already had two young children of her own, Charles and Claire. Godwin's friends were not impressed. Many of them described his new wife as quick-tempered and quarrelsome. Godwin, however, was devoted to her, and by most accounts, the marriage itself was a success. Mary, though, felt very differently. She came to actively detest her stepmother, and later biographer Charles Keegan Paul even suggested that the new Mrs. Godwin favoured her own children over Mary Wollstonecraft's, which, if true, would have had a huge emotional impact on Mary's upbringing. Together, the Godwins set up a publishing business called M.J. Godwin. They sold children's books, along with stationery, maps, and games. A really progressive idea for the time. Unfortunately, though, it didn't make money at all. Godwin was forced to borrow large sums just to keep the business afloat, and then borrowed more money to pay off the earlier loans, which only made things worse. By 1809, the business was close to collapse, and Godwin himself was described as being near to despair. In the end, he was only saved from debtor's prison thanks to philosophical supporters, people like Francis Place, who stepped in and lent him even more money. So although Mary didn't receive much in the way of formal schooling, her father was very hands-on when it came to her education. He personally tutored her in a wide range of subjects, and he often took the children out on what we probably now call educational trips. On top of that, Mary had access not just to Godwin's library, but to the many intellectuals who passed through his home, including the romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and rather astonishingly, Aaron Burr, the former Vice President of the United States. Now, Godwin openly admitted that he wasn't educating his children according to Mary Wollstonecraft's own educational philosophy, the ideas she'd laid out in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman back in 1792. Even so, Mary still received an education that was highly unusual and pretty advanced for a girl at the time. She had a governess, a daily tutor, and she read many of her father's children's books on Roman and Greek history, often while they were still in manuscript form. For 6 months in 1811, she also attended a boarding school in Ramsgate. And when Mary was just 15, her father described her in terms that are honestly quite striking. He called her singularly bold, somewhat imperious, and active of mind, adding that her desire of knowledge is great and her perseverance in everything she undertakes almost invincible. In June 1812, Godwin sent Mary to stay with the family of the radical William Baxter near Dundee in Scotland. Writing to Baxter, he was very clear about what he wanted for his daughter, saying, "I am anxious that she should be brought up like a philosopher, even like a cynic." Historians have since debated why he sent her away, whether it was for her health, to distance her from the harsher realities of his failing business, or to immerse herself in a more fully in radical political thinking. What we do know is that Mary absolutely thrived there. She loved the open space around the Baxters' home and the companionship of Baxter's 4 daughters, and she returned north again in the summer of 1813 for another stay, this time lasting 10 months. Looking back years later, in the 1831 introduction to Frankenstein, she remembered this period with real affection, writing, "I wrote then, but in a most commonplace style. It was beneath the trees of the grounds belonging to our house, or on the bleak sides of the woodless mountains near, that my true compositions, the airy flights of my imagination, were born and fostered." Mary may have first met the radical poet philosopher Percy Bysshe Shelley in the gap between her 2 stays in Scotland. By the time she returned home for the second time on the 30th of March 1814, Percy Shelley had already become estranged from his wife and was regularly visiting William Godwin, partly because he'd agreed to help bail him out of debt. Percy's politics are really important here. His radicalism, especially his economic views, came largely from reading Godwin's Political Justice, which was published in 1793, and these ideas had completely alienated him from his wealthy aristocratic family. They wanted him to live like a traditional member of the landed elite. Percy, on the other hand, wanted to give away large portions of the family's money to schemes designed to help the disadvantaged. Unsurprisingly, this caused problems. His family deliberately restricted his access to money because they didn't want it being spent on what they saw as reckless projects of so-called political justice. As a result, Percy found himself constantly short of funds. Even though he was technically an heir, after months of assurances, he eventually admitted that he either couldn't or wouldn't pay off all of Godwin's debts after all. Godwin was furious and felt deeply betrayed. Around this time, Mary and Percy began meeting in secret, and the location they chose is about as symbolic as it gets. They met at Mary Wollstonecraft's grave in the churchyard of St. Pancras Old Church. It was there that they fell in love. Mary was just 16 and Percy was 21. On the 26th of June 1814, Shelley and Mary declared their love for one another. Percy told her he could no longer hide his ardent passion, and Mary later described responding in what she called a sublime and rapturous moment, that she felt the same. Either that day or the next, Mary lost her virginity to Shelley, something tradition claims happened in the churchyard itself. Mary later described herself as being drawn to Shelley's wild, intellectual, and unearthly looks. Her father, however, was horrified. To Mary's deep distress, Godwin disapproved of the relationship and tried to put a stop to it, determined to protect what he called the spotless fame of his daughter. Almost simultaneously, he discovered the full extent of Percy's financial unreliability, which only made matters worse. Mary was left emotionally torn. She later wrote of my excessive and romantic attachment to my father, and she struggled to reconcile her love from him with her love for Percy. Part of the confusion came from the fact that she saw Percy as a living embodiment of her parents' radical ideals from the 1790s, especially Godwin's earlier argument that marriage was a kind of repressive monopoly, an idea he'd put forward in Political Justice before later softening his position. In the end, Mary chose Percy. On the 28th of July 1814, the couple eloped, secretly leaving England for France. They were joined by Mary's stepsister, Claire Clermont. Mary Jane Godwin pursued them to Calais. But once the trio convinced her they had no intention of returning, they continued on to Paris and then travelled through a France still devastated by war. They went by donkey, mule, carriage, and on foot, eventually heading towards Switzerland. Looking back later, Mary described the experience as feeling utterly unreal, writing in 1826, "It was acting in a novel, being an incarnate romance." Godwin, meanwhile, wrote bitterly about France in 1814, describing the distress of the inhabitants whose houses had been burnt, their cattle killed, and all their wealth destroyed, and saying that it intensified his hatred of war. As Mary and Percy travelled, they read works by Mary Wollstonecraft and other writers, kept a joint journal, and continued writing themselves. Eventually, reality caught up with them. In Lucerne, a lack of money forced the three to turn back. They travelled down the Rhine, then overland to the Dutch port of Maasluis, before finally arriving back in England at Gravesend, Kent, on the 13th of September 1814. The situation Mary returned to in England was more complicated than she expected. Somewhere before or during the journey, she'd become pregnant. Now penniless and with a child on the way, she and Percy found themselves in a very tough spot. And to Mary's genuine shock, her father refused to have anything to do with her. The couple moved with Claire Clermont into lodgings in Somers Town and later to Nelson Square. Despite everything, they kept up a rigorous routine of reading and writing and entertained Percy's circle of friends, including Thomas Jefferson Hogg and the writer Thomas Love Peacock. Percy Shelley sometimes had to leave home for short stretches to avoid creditors, and letters from the couple during these times reveal just how painful these separations were. Pregnant and often ill, Mary had to deal with the added strain of Percy's joy at the birth of his son by his estranged wife Harriet Shelley later in 1814. Percy's frequent outings with Claire, who was almost certainly his lover, stirred up a lot of jealousy in Mary. There's a particularly telling story where Shelley, during a walk in the French countryside, suggested that Mary and he both jump naked into a stream. This was completely against Mary's principles and deeply offended her. Amid all this turmoil, Mary found some comfort in visits from Hogg. She didn't like him at first, but he soon became a close friend. Interestingly, Percy seems to have wanted Mary and Hogg to become lovers. Mary didn't entirely dismiss this idea, since she believed in the principle of free love. But in reality, she loved only Percy and didn't take things any further than flirting with Hogg. On the 22nd of February 1815, Mary gave birth prematurely to a baby girl, who was not expected to survive. Just days later, on the 6th of March, Mary wrote this to Hogg. "My dearest Hogg, my baby is dead. Will you come to see me as soon as you can? I wish to see you. It was perfectly well when I went to bed. I awoke in the night to give it suck. It appeared to be sleeping so quietly that I would not awake it. It was dead then, but we did not find that out till morning. From its appearance, it evidently died of convulsions. Will you come? You are so calm a creature, and Shelley is afraid of a fever from the milk, for I am no longer a mother now." The loss, understandably, devastated Mary, plunging her into a deep depression, haunted by visions of her child. But she did conceive again, and by the summer she had begun to recover. With Percy's finances improving after the death of his grandfather, Sir Shelley, the couple went on to holiday to Torquay and then rented a two-storey cottage at Bishopsgate near Windsor Great Park. We don't know much about Mary's life during this period. Her journal from May 1815 to July 1816 has been lost. While at Bishopsgate, Percy wrote his poem Alastor, or otherwise known as The Spirit of Solitude, and on the 24th of January 1816, Mary gave birth to their second child, William, named after her father and soon nicknamed Will Mouse. Later, in her novel The Last Man, she would imagine Windsor as a kind of Garden of Eden. In May 1816, Mary, Percy, and their son set off for Geneva, joined by Claire Clement. Their plan was to spend the summer with the poet Lord Byron, whose recent affair with Claire had left her pregnant. Mary later described the journey in History of a 6 Weeks Tour through a part of France, Switzerland, Germany, and Holland in 1817, painting a bleak picture of the landscape as they crossed from France into Switzerland. The group arrived in Geneva on the 14th of May 1816, and Mary was already calling herself Mrs. Shelley. Byron joined them on the 25th of May, accompanied by his young doctor John William Polidori. They rented the Villa Diodati near Lake Geneva in the village of Cologne, while Percy Shelley took a smaller house nearby called Mason Chaffus. The summer was spent writing, boating on the lake, and talking late into the night. Mary recalled in 1831 that it proved a wet, ungenial summer, with incessant rain often confining us for days to the house. One evening, sitting around the fire at Byron's villa, the group amused themselves with German ghost stories. This sparked Byron's famous proposal that they each write a ghost story. Young Mary was unable to come up with anything and grew anxious. She remembered Have you thought of a story? I was asked each morning, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative. Then, one evening in mid June, the conversation turned to the principle of life itself. Mary noted, perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Unable to sleep after midnight, Mary's imagination took over as she experienced what she called a waking dream. This is what she said she pictured. The pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. She began writing what she expected to be a short story, but with Percy's encouragement, she expanded it into her first novel, Frankenstein, or otherwise titled The Modern Prometheus, published in 1818. Mary later described that summer in Switzerland as the moment when I first stepped out from childhood into life. The story of how Frankenstein came to be has since been fictionalized many times and been inspired in numerous films. Interestingly, in September 2011, astronomer Donald Olson, after visiting the Lake Geneva Villa and analysing the positions of the moon and stars, concluded that Mary's waking dream probably happened between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on the 16th of June 1816, just days after Byron's initial challenge to write ghost stories. But before we move on, it's worth taking a moment to address the ongoing debate about Percy's role in writing Frankenstein. While Percy certainly encouraged Mary's writing, and his involvement has long been a subject of discussion, the exact extent of his contribution remains unclear and has sparked plenty of argument among readers and critics. Mary herself was quite clear on this. She wrote, I certainly did not owe the suggestion of one incident, nor scarcely of one train of feeling to my husband, and yet but for his incitement, it would never have taken the form in which it was presented to the world. She also mentioned that the preface to the first edition was Percy's work, as far as I can recollect. It's interesting to note that there are differences between the 1818, 1823, and 1831 editions of Frankenstein, which some have attributed to Percy's editing. James Rieger, a scholar, argued that Percy's assistance at every point in the book's manufacture was so extensive that one hardly knows whether to regard him as editor or minor collaborator. On the other hand, Anne K. Mellor later suggested that Percy only made many technical corrections and several times clarified the narrative and thematic continuity of the text. Then there's Charles E. Robinson, the editor of a facsimile edition of the Frankenstein manuscripts, who concluded that Percy's contributions were no more than what most publishers, editors have provided new or old authors, or in fact what colleagues have provided to each other after reading each other's works in progress. Jumping forward to the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, literary scholar and poet Fiona Sampson posed the question, why hasn't Mary Shelley gotten the respect she deserves? She noted that in recent years, Percy's corrections, visible in the Frankenstein notebooks held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, have been seized on as evidence that he must have at least co-authored the novel. In fact, when I examined the notebooks myself, I realised that Percy did rather less than any line editor working in publishing today. Sampson shared her research in Search of Mary Shelley 2018, one of the many biographies dedicated to Mary Shelley's life and work. So, while Percy's influence and support are undeniable, the novel Frankenstein remains very much Mary Shelley's own creation. When Mary and Percy returned to England in September 1816, they moved to Bath, bringing Claire Clement with them, who took lodgings nearby. They were hoping to keep Claire's pregnancy under wraps. While they were in Colgany, Mary had received two letters from her half-sister Fanny Imlay, who hinted at her unhappy life. Then, on the 9th of October, Fanny sent what was then described as an alarming letter from Bristol, which sent Percy rushing off to find her, but he was unsuccessful. Tragically, the very next morning, on the 10th of October, Fanny was found dead in a Swansea inn room alongside a suicide note and a bottle of laudanum. Just 2 months later, on the 10th of December, Percy's estranged wife Harriet Shelley was discovered drowned in Serpentine Lake in Hyde Park, London. Both suicides were quietly hushed up. Harriet's family actively blocked Percy's attempts, with full support from Mary to gain custody of his two children by Harriet. Percy's lawyers advised him that his best chance of winning custody was to marry Mary, who was pregnant again. So, on the 30th of December 1816, Mary and Percy married at St Mildred's Church, Bread Street in London. Mary's father gave his consent, which was legally required since she was under the age of 21, and both Mr. and Mrs. Godwin were present as witnesses who signed the register. This marriage finally ended the rift within the family. Claire Clement gave birth to a baby girl on the 13th of January, initially named Alba, but later renamed to Allegra. In March that year, the Chancery Court ruled Percy morally unfit to have custody of his children, who were then placed with a clergyman's family. Also in March, the Shelleys moved, along with Claire and baby Alba, to Albion House in Marlow, Buckinghamshire. It was a large damp place on the banks of the River Thames. While at Marlow, Mary gave birth to her third child, Clara, on the 2nd of September. The household entertained new friends like Marianne and Leigh Hunt, worked hard on their writing, and often discussed politics. By early summer of 1817, Mary finished Frankenstein, which was then published anonymously in January 1818. Reviewers and readers assumed Percy was the author since the book carried his preface and was dedicated to his political hero, William Godwin. While at Marlow, Mary also edited the joint journal of their 1814 continental travels, adding material she'd written in Switzerland in 1816, along with Percy's poem Mont Blanc. The result was History of a 6 Weeks Tour, published in November 1817. That autumn, Percy often lived away in London to avoid his creditors. Faced with the threat of debtor's prison, ongoing ill health, and the fear of losing custody of their children, the couple decided to leave England for Italy on the 12th of March 1818, taking Claire Clement and baby Alba with them. And as far as anyone knew, they had no intention of ever coming back. One of the first things the Shelleys did upon arriving in Italy was to hand baby Alba over to Byron, who was living in Venice. He agreed to raise the child, but only on the condition that Claire Clement had nothing more to do with her. Nice guy. From there, Mary and Percy Shelley embarked on a roving existence, never really settling in one place for long. Along the way, they gathered a circle of friends and acquaintances, many of whom travelled with them. Their days were devoted to writing, reading, learning, sightseeing, and socialising. But this Italian adventure was overshadowed by deep personal loss for Mary. Both her children, Clara and William, died. Clara in September 1818 in Venice, and William in June 1819 in Rome. These tragedies left Mary in a profound depression, isolating her from Percy. He wrote in his notebook, "My dearest Mary, wherefore hast thou gone, and left me in this dreary world alone? Thy form is here indeed a lovely one, but thou art fled, gone down a dreary road, that leads to sorrow's most obscure abode. For thine own sake I cannot follow thee, do thou return for mine." For a time, writing was Mary's only solace. Then the birth of her fourth child, Percy Florence, on the 12th of November 1819, finally lifted her spirits, though she carried the memory of her lost children for the rest of her life. Italy offered the Shelleys and Byron and other exiles a political freedom they couldn't find at home. Despite the pain, Mary came to see Italy as a country which memory painted as paradise. Their years there were a time of intense creativity and intellectual activity. Percy wrote major poems, and while Mary penned the novel Matilda, the historical novel Valperga, and the plays Proserpine and Midas, she wrote Valperga partly to help her father's financial troubles, since Percy refused to support him any further. Mary was often ill and prone to depression, and she had to cope with Percy's attentions to other women, including Sophia Stacey, Amelia Vivani, and Jane Williams. Since Mary shared Percy's belief in non-exclusive marriage, she formed her own emotional attachments within their circle. She became particularly fond of the Greek revolutionary Prince Alexandros Mavrocordatos and Jane and Edward Williams. In December 1818, the Shelleys travelled south with Claire and their servants to Naples, where they stayed for 3 months. They received only one visitor, a physician. However, in 1820, they faced accusations and threats from Paolo and Elise Foggy, former servants of Percy had dismissed in Naples soon after they married. The Fogies claimed that on the 27th of February 1819, Percy had registered a 2-month-old baby girl named Eleanor Adelaide Shelley as his child by Mary. They also alleged Claire Clemence was the baby's mother. Biographers have speculated various explanations: that Percy adopted a local child, that the baby was his by Elise, Claire, or an unknown woman, or even that she was Elise's child by Byron. Mary insisted she would have known if Claire had been pregnant, but how much she really knew remains unclear. Mary later described Naples as a paradise inhabited by devils. Whatever the truth, Eleanor Adelaide Shelley died in Naples on the 9th of June 1820. After leaving Naples, the Shelleys settled in Rome. Percy described the city as a place where the meanest streets were strewed with truncated columns, broken capitals, and sparkling fragments of granite. The voice of dead time in still vibrations is breathed from these dumb things. Inspired by Rome, Mary began writing the unfinished novel Valerius, the reanimated Roman, about a hero resisting the decay of Rome and the influence of superstitious Catholicism. Her writing was interrupted when her son, William, sadly died of malaria. Mary bitterly reflected that she had come to Italy hoping to improve Percy's health, only for the climate to take her 2 children. She wrote to her friend Marianne, "May you, my dear Marianne, never know what it is to lose 2 only and lovely children in 1 year, to watch their dying moments and then at last to be left childless and forever miserable." To cope with her grief, Mary wrote the novella The Fields of Fancy, which became Matilda. It tells the story of a young woman whose beauty inspires incestuous love in her father, who ultimately kills himself to stop himself acting on these feelings. Meanwhile, Matilda lives in despair over the unnatural love I had inspired. The novella offered a sharp feminist critique of patriarchal society. Matilda is punished in the afterlife despite not encouraging her father's feelings. In the summer of 1822, a pregnant Mary moved with Percy, Claire, and Edward and Jane Williams to the isolated Villa Magni, a small house by the sea near the hamlet of San Terenzo in the Bay of Legrisi. Once they were settled, Percy broke the evil news to Claire that her daughter, Allegra, had died of typhus in a convent. Mary found life at the villa distracting and unhappy. She came to think of it as a sort of dungeon. But then, on the 16th of June, tragedy struck again. Mary miscarried, losing so much blood that she nearly died. Rather than waiting for a doctor, Percy took quick action, sitting her in a bath of ice to stop the bleeding, something the doctor later told him had saved her life. But things weren't well between Mary and Percy that summer. Percy spent more time with Jane Williams than he did his wife, who was both depressed and physically weakened. Much of the short poetry Percy wrote while at San Terenzo was actually about Jane rather than Mary. The coast, however, offered Percy and Edward Williams some diversion, a chance to enjoy their perfect plaything for the summer, a new sailing boat. This boat had been designed by Daniel Roberts and Edward Trelawney, an admirer of Byron who had joined their group in the January of 1822. On the 1st of July 1822, Percy Shelley, Edward Williams, and Captain Daniel Roberts set sail down the coast. While there, Percy discussed plans with Byron and Leigh Hunt for launching a radical magazine called The Liberal. On the 8th of July, Percy and Edward Williams began the journey back with their 18-year-old boat boy Charles Vivian, but they never made it. A letter arrived at the villa from Leigh Hunt, dated the 8th of July, saying, "Pray write to tell us how you got home, for they say you had bad weather after you sailed Monday, and we are anxious." Mary recalled later, "The paper fell from me. I trembled all over." She and Jane Williams rushed desperately to Livorno and then Pisa, clinging to the fading hope that their husbands were still alive. 10 days after their storm, 3 bodies were washed up on the coast, halfway between Livorno and Risi. Their friends Trelawney, Byron, and Hunt cremated Percy Shelley's body on the beach. After the tragic death of her husband, Mary Shelley spent about a year living with Leigh Hunt and his family. While there, she often saw Byron and helped by transcribing his poems. Determined to support herself and her son through her writing, Mary found her financial situation precarious. On the 23rd of July 1823, she left and returned to England. She stayed with her father and stepmother in the Strand until a small advance from her father-in-law allowed her to find her own lodgings nearby. Sir Timothy Shelley, Percy's father, had originally agreed to support his grandson Percy Florence, only if Mary handed him over to an appointed guardian. Mary rejected this outright, and I don't blame her, to be honest. Sorry, that was just my little opinion. Sometimes I get quite involved when researching. Instead, she managed to secure a limited annual allowance from Sir Timothy, which she had to repay once Percy Florence inherited the estate. However, Sir Timothy refused to meet Mary in person and dealt with her only through lawyers until the end of his life. Mary kept busy editing Percy's poems and working on other literary projects, but her concerns for her son restricted her options. Sir Timothy even threatened to cut off the allowance if any biography of Percy was to be published. In 1826, after the death of Percy's half-brother Charles Shelley, Percy Florence became the legal heir to the Shelley estate. Sir Timothy then raised Mary's allowance from £100 to £250 per year, but he remained as difficult as ever. Though Mary enjoyed the stimulating company of William Godwin's circle, poverty limited her socialising, and she felt ostracised by those too. Like Sir Timothy, still disapproved of her relationship with Percy Shelley. On the 29th of August 1823, Mary attended the premiere of Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, which was the first stage adaptation of her novel, at the English Opera House in London's West End. The play's popularity sparked a second printing of Frankenstein and many more theatrical adaptations. In the summer of 1824, Mary moved to Kentish Town in North London to be near Jane Williams. Biographer Muriel Sparks suggests may have been a little in love with Jane. However, Jane later disillusioned Mary by gossiping that Percy had preferred her over Mary due to Mary's inadequacy as a wife. Around this time, Mary was working on her novel The Last Man and helped friends writing memoirs of Byron and Percy, early efforts to immortalize her late husband. She also met the American actor John Howard Payne and the American writer Washington Irving, both of whom intrigued her. Payne fell in love with Mary and proposed in 1826, but she declined, saying that after being married to one genius, she certainly could only marry another. Payne accepted her refusal and even tried without success to persuade Irving to propose instead. Mary was aware of Payne's plan, but it's unclear how seriously she took it. In 1827, Mary found herself involved in a rather secretive scheme to help her friend Isabel Robinson and Isabel's lover, Mary Diana Dodds, who wrote under the male pseudonym of David Lindsay, to start a life together in France as husband and wife. With the help of John Howard Payne, though she kept the full details from him, Mary managed to obtain false passports for the couple. The following year, in 1828, Mary fell ill with smallpox while visiting them in Paris. Thankfully, she recovered without any scarring, but she lost the youthful beauty she once had. Between 1827 and 1840, Mary was extremely busy as an editor and writer. She published several novels: The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck in 1830, Lodore in 1835, and Faulkner in 1837. She also contributed 5 volumes of Lives of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and French authors, and wrote stories for ladies' magazines. Mary continued to support her father, and they looked out for publishers for each other. In 1830, she sold the copyright for a new edition of Frankenstein for £60 to Henry Colburn and Richard Bentley for their standard novel series. After her father died in 1836, aged 80, she began compiling his letters and writing a memoir as he had requested in his will, but after 2 years, she abandoned the project. Throughout this period, Mary tirelessly championed Percy's poetry, pushing for its publication and quoting it in her own writing. By 1837, Percy's work had become well known and increasingly admired. In the summer of 1838, Edward Moxon, the publisher of Tennyson and son-in-law of Charles Lamb, proposed publishing a collected works edition of Percy's poems. Mary was keen to include an unexpurgated version of Queen Mab, Percy's radical epic poem. Moxon wanted to leave out the most shocking and parts, but Mary prevailed thanks to Harriet de Boinville lending her Percy's original copy. Mary was paid £500 to edit poetical works in 1838, though Sir Timothy insisted it should not include a biography. Still, Mary found a clever way to tell Percy's story by including extensive biographical notes about the poems themselves. True to her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft's feminist principles, Mary Shelley continued to extend help to women society disapproved of. For example, she supported Mary Diana Dodds, a single mother and an apparent lesbian, helping her live under the new identity of Walter Sholto Douglas, the husband of Isabel Robinson. She also aided Georgiana Poole, a woman rejected by her husband for alleged adultery. Mary wrote in her diary about such acts, "I do not make a boast, I do not say aloud, behold my generosity and greatness of mind, for in truth it is simple justice I perform, and so I am still reviled for being worldly." Mary remained cautious in romance. In 1828, she met and flirted with a French writer, but the one surviving letter to him seems to deflect his declaration of love. She was delighted when her old friend from Italy, Edward Trelawney, returned to England, and they joked about marriage in their letters. However, their friendship cooled after she refused to cooperate with his proposed biography of Percy, and he was upset by her omission of the section of Queen Mab. Hints in her journals from early 1830s to early 1840s suggest Mary may have had feelings for the radical politician Aubrey Beauclerk, who disappointed her by marrying others twice. Throughout these years, Mary's first concern was the welfare of her son, Percy Florence, honouring her late husband's wish. And with Sir Timothy's reluctant help, she ensured Percy Florence was educated at Harrow School. To avoid boarding fees, Mary moved to Harrow on the Hill herself, so Percy could attend as a day pupil. Though Percy went on to Trinity College, Cambridge, and dabbled in politics and law, he showed none of the remarkable talents his parents had. In 1840 and 1842, Mary travelled across the continent with her son Percy. She recorded these journeys in Rambles in Germany and Italy in 1840, 1842, and 1843, which was published in 1844. Then, in 1844, Sir Timothy Shelley passed away at the age of 90. What Mary described quite poetically as falling from the stalk like an overblown flower. For the first time, Mary and her son were financially independent, though sadly the estate was not quite as valuable as they'd hoped. The mid-1840s proved stressful for Mary in other ways. She became the target of three separate blackmailers. In 1845, an Italian political exile, whom she'd met in Paris, threatened to publish letters she had sent him. Fortunately, a friend of her son bribed a police chief to seize the papers, including those letters, and they were destroyed. Around the same time, Mary brought back some letters she and Percy had written from a man calling himself G. Byron, who pretended to be the illegitimate son of the late Lord Byron. Also in 1845, Percy Shelley's cousin, Thomas Medwin, approached Mary claiming he had written a damaging biography of Percy. He demanded £250 to suppress it, but Mary refused. In 1848, Percy Florence married Jane Gibson St. John, and their marriage was a happy one. Mary and Jane got along well, and Mary lived with them both at Field Place in Sussex, the Shelleys' ancestral home, as well as at Chester Square in London. She also accompanied them on travels abroad. Mary's final years, however, were overshadowed by illness. From 1839 onwards, she suffered frequent headaches and bouts of paralysis that sometimes left her unable to read or write. On the 1st of February 1851 at Chester Square, Mary Shelley died aged just 53. Her doctor suspected a brain tumour. Jane Shelley later said Mary had wished to be buried alongside her mother and father, but Percy and Jane found the St. Pancras graveyard dreadful and instead laid her to rest at St. Peter's Church in Bournemouth, near their home in Boscombe. On the first anniversary of Mary's death, the family opened her box desk. Inside were locks of hair from her deceased children, a notebook she had shared with Percy Shelley, and a copy of his poem, Adonis, with a page folded around the silk parcel holding some of his ashes and the remains of his heart. Mary Shelley's life was nothing short of extraordinary. A turbulent journey marked by profound love, devastating loss, and a relentless courage from the very beginning. She was surrounded by tragedy. Her mother died just days after her birth, leaving her to grow up with the shadow of a legacy both inspiring and burdensome. Yet Mary did not let this define her. Instead, she forged her own path through a world that was often unforgiving, especially to women who dare to defy convention. Her story is inseparable from the man she loved, Percy, a brilliant poet but also a figure of chaos and contradiction. Together, they lived a life on the edge, fleeing debt, scandal, and heartbreak, yet always bound by a shared vision of freedom and intellectual rebellion. And through it all, Mary's voice emerged clear, fearless, and groundbreaking. Frankenstein was more than just a novel. It was a revolutionary act of imagination and defiance, a story born from sleepless nights and the darkest storms of the human soul. It reflected Mary's own experiences of creation and destruction, loss and hope. The very fact that she produced such timeless work amid the constant upheaval of her personal life is a testament to her strength and her determination. But Mary's life was not only shaped by the triumphs of her literary success. It was marked by heartbreaks that would have crushed a lesser spirit. The deaths of her children, the drowning of Percy Shelley, and the social ostracism she endured. These wounds ran deep. Yet, through the grief and the isolation Mary Shelley endured, she turned pain into purpose, loss into creativity, and solitude into a voice that still echoes across centuries. Her struggle for recognition too was monumental, battling the constant overshadowing of Percy's legacy, the doubts cast on her authorship, and the pressures of a society eager to silence her. Mary fought fiercely to claim her rightful place in literary history, and claim it she did. Her influence shaping not only literature but the very way we think about science, ethics, and humanity. In the end, Mary Shelley's life is a profound reminder that genius and suffering often walk hand in hand, that the brightest flames can burn amidst the darkest storms, that resilience is not the absence of pain but the will to rise time and time again, no matter how many times you fall. She was a daughter, a lover, a mother, a writer, and a pioneer. But above all, she was a woman who refused to be silenced, who dared to imagine the unimaginable, and in doing so, changed the world forever. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson Mary Shelley offers us, that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most alone or broken, the power to create, to fight, and to leave a lasting mark lies within us all. Okay, everyone, that was the incredible and hauntingly tragic life of Mary Shelley. I'm really, really pleased. When I researched this, I was just glad that by the end of her life, she was able to see Percy Florence, grow up, get married. And I feel like the universe owed her that, to be honest, after all the loss she had endured during her lifetime. So come and join me next week when we will be delving into the life of the incredible and famous Oscar Wilde, famous for works such as The Picture of Dorian Gray. That's going to be a very juicy and entertaining listen. In the meantime, please follow the podcast, like it, leave a review. You know the drill by now. And come and see us on Instagram at the Author Files Podcast, or on TikTok. Just search for the Author Files. You can also see some of my funny reels and sort of stuff like that. And also check out the website, theauthorfiles.co.uk. So that's it from me. I've now got to go and peel some potatoes. I hope by the time you've listened to this, you're going to be up to something much better than that. Anyway, I digress, and I will catch you guys next week for Oscar Wilde. Alright, stay safe, stay happy, and stay reading. See ya.